Did women in the 13th century truly live independently, earning their own money and choosing their own path, defying the expectations of a world dominated by men and the church? Could a spiritual movement arise that welcomed women of all social classes, giving them a voice and a purpose outside of marriage or cloistered vows? What if their very freedom led to both admiration and fierce persecution from powerful forces? Get ready to explore the surprising world of the Beguine Sisterhoods from the 12th to the 14th century, a time that saw some of the most radical spiritual and social experiments in European history. Number 11. Their self-governance was a quiet revolution. Imagine a community of women, numbering in the hundreds, sometimes even thousands, living within the bustling walls of a medieval city. These women were not nuns, yet they lived a devout life. They were not wives, yet they were not bound by the strict enclosure of a monastery. How did such a unique social and spiritual experiment manage itself? The answer lies in their remarkable system of self-governance, a feature that stood in stark contrast to nearly every other female religious institution of the Middle Ages. Each beguinage, the walled community where Beguines lived, was a small, self-contained republic. At its head stood a figure known by various titles: the Grand Mistress, the Magistra, or the Prioress. This wasn't a position handed down by a bishop or an abbot. This was an elected office. The Beguines themselves, the women who lived and worked within those walls, chose their leader. This act of democratic selection, in an age where power was typically inherited or appointed by male authority, was nothing short of revolutionary, even if it often happened within the confines of their spiritual communities. The Grand Mistress was responsible for the daily administration of the beguinage. She oversaw the community's finances, which could be considerable, given that Beguines often owned property, operated businesses, and managed substantial dowries brought in by wealthier members. She was the one who ensured the rules of the community were followed, rules that were not imposed by a distant pope or a powerful bishop, but often developed and agreed upon by the Beguines themselves, adapting to the specific needs and character of their local community. Consider the great beguinage of Ghent, for example, a sprawling complex that housed hundreds of women. Its Grand Mistress would have managed a sophisticated operation, from coordinating the sale of textiles produced by the Beguines to overseeing the care of the sick within their infirmaries. She would have represented the beguinage in dealings with the city council, the local bishop, and even powerful noble patrons. She was a woman of significant influence, wielding authority within her community in a way that very few women in medieval society ever could. This system meant that decisions about communal life, spiritual practice, and economic endeavors were made internally. If new members sought admission, the Grand Mistress and a council of older, more experienced Beguines would evaluate their suitability. If disputes arose between Beguines, it was the Grand Mistress who mediated, offering guidance and resolving conflicts. This internal judicial system kept the beguinage largely independent of external ecclesiastical courts, which often had little understanding of the unique Beguine way of life. The election of the Grand Mistress was often a carefully considered process. The Beguines would choose someone known for her piety, her administrative skills, and her wisdom. She might serve for a set term or for life, depending on the custom of the particular beguinage. This model of leadership fostered a strong sense of ownership and collective responsibility among the Beguines. They were not subjects of a distant male authority. They were active participants in the governance of their own lives and communities. This independence, however, also made them a target. The Church, accustomed to hierarchical control and male leadership, often viewed the Beguines' self-governance with suspicion. How could women, without formal vows or clerical oversight, manage their own spiritual and temporal affairs? This questioning often led to accusations of heresy or unorthodox practices, as external authorities struggled to fit the Beguine model into their established frameworks. Yet, for centuries, Beguines persisted, demonstrating that women were perfectly capable of ordering their own lives and communities, nurturing both their spiritual growth and their material well-being, all under the guidance of their chosen female leaders. Their beguinages stood as quiet, self-governing havens in a turbulent world. Number 10. Their communities often embraced communal property with a twist. The notion of communal property often brings to mind strict monastic orders where individuals own nothing, dedicating all possessions to the shared life of the community. Beguines, however, presented a more nuanced approach, a fascinating blend of individual ownership and collective resources that reflected their unique position somewhere between the secular world and the traditional religious life. It was a practical system that supported their independence while maintaining a sense of sisterhood. When a woman joined a beguinage, she often brought with her a dowry or her own personal wealth. Unlike a nun, who would typically surrender all her possessions to the monastery upon taking vows, a beguine largely retained ownership of her property. This meant she could continue to manage her own finances, receive inheritances, and even bequeath her property as she wished. This individual financial autonomy was a cornerstone of Beguine life, allowing them a degree of personal freedom rarely seen among medieval women, especially those living a religious life. However, this individual ownership existed within a framework of shared resources and responsibilities. The beguinage itself owned significant communal property. This included the walls that enclosed the community, the gates that controlled entry, and often the main church or chapel where the Beguines worshipped together. It also included communal infirmaries for the sick, shared laundries, bakeries, and workshops where Beguines engaged in their trades like weaving or lace making. These facilities were maintained and funded by the collective contributions of the Beguines, often through a system of fees or taxes paid to the beguinage administration. The living arrangements further illustrate this balance. Each beguine typically had her own small house or room within the beguinage walls. These houses were often privately owned by the Beguines themselves, passed down through families, or purchased upon entry. This private space allowed for individual privacy and a sense of personal belonging, a stark contrast to the dormitories found in many monasteries. Yet these individual dwellings were clustered together, forming a shared urban village. The streets, the communal gardens, and the shared wells were all part of the collective space maintained by the community for the benefit of all its members. Consider the Beguines of Bruges, a city renowned for its textile industry. Many Beguines there were skilled weavers and lace makers. While they might own their own looms or tools, the raw materials were often purchased in bulk by the beguinage administration, or the finished goods were sold collectively through the beguinage's established networks. Income from these communal ventures would then contribute to the upkeep of the shared facilities, the care of elderly or infirm Beguines, or even charitable endeavors outside the beguinage walls. This allowed them to leverage economies of scale and collective market power. This unique blend of individual and communal property was a practical solution to their status. It allowed women to live a devout life without being entirely dependent on the church or family for support. Their individual wealth gave them a degree of security and independence, while the communal resources fostered a strong sense of community and mutual aid. It allowed for the flexibility to accommodate women from different economic backgrounds. Wealthy widows could contribute more, while poorer women could still find a place within the shared framework, benefiting from the communal infrastructure and opportunities for work. This system meant that Beguines were not simply given a life by an external authority. They were active economic participants, contributing their own resources and labor to the maintenance and flourishing of their shared spiritual home. It was a pragmatic arrangement, that empowered individual women while binding them together in a self-sustaining and often thriving community, a testament to their innovative approach to religious life and economic independence. Number 9. They faced both protection and persecution for their independence. The Beguines occupied a precarious position in medieval society. Their unique lifestyle, blending devout spirituality with an unusual degree of independence, made them figures of both admiration and deep suspicion. For centuries, they navigated a complex landscape of patronage and persecution, revealing the fragile nature of their freedom in a world that struggled to categorize them. On one hand, Beguines often enjoyed the patronage of powerful figures. Noblewomen, wealthy merchants, and even royalty sometimes admired their piety, their charitable work, and their self-sufficiency. These benefactors might donate land for beguinages, provide funds for their infirmaries, or even offer legal protection. For example, some beguinages flourished under the protection of the Counts of Flanders or the Dukes of Brabant, who saw the Beguines as valuable contributors to urban life, providing social services, economic activity, and a source of quiet spiritual devotion. They were seen as a moral anchor in busy towns. Consider the Beguinage of St. Elizabeth in Ghent, founded in the 13th century. It grew into a vast complex protected by powerful local authorities, providing a secure home for hundreds of women. Its very existence and expansion were testaments to the support it garnered from the secular elite, who often valued the Beguines' contributions to the city's well-being, especially their role in nursing the sick and caring for the poor. These rulers recognized the practical benefits of having such communities within their domains. However, this same independence and their unorthodox status also made them vulnerable. They did not fit neatly into the established categories of medieval religious life. They were not nuns, bound by solemn vows and under the direct authority of a bishop or a male order. They were not laywomen, fully integrated into secular society. They existed in a liminal space, which made them difficult to control and understand from the perspective of the rigid church hierarchy. This ambiguity often led to accusations of heresy. Without formal vows, could they truly be considered religious? Without strict enclosure, were they exposed to dangerous secular influences? Their emphasis on personal spiritual experience, often expressed through vernacular mysticism, was particularly unsettling to authorities who preferred Latin, established doctrine, and mediation. The spiritual writings of figures like Mechthild of Magdeburg or Hadewig, while deeply devotional, explored direct union with God in ways that some viewed as dangerously close to heresy. The most tragic example of this persecution is the fate of Marguerite Porete. A Beguine from Hainaut, she wrote a mystical text called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which advocated a radical detachment from the world and even from virtue itself, in order to achieve a state of pure love for God. While highly influential among some mystics, its teachings were deemed heretical by the Church. Despite her attempts to defend her work, she was eventually condemned and burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. Her execution sent a chilling message to other Beguines and vernacular mystics. Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312 further solidified the Church's suspicion, issuing a decree that condemned certain aspects of the Beguine life, particularly their lack of formal vows and their perceived unorthodoxy. While this decree was often interpreted broadly and unevenly applied, it cast a shadow over many Beguine communities, leading to increased scrutiny and sometimes suppression. Many beguinages were forced to adapt, often seeking formal recognition or stricter rules to survive. Despite these challenges, many Beguine communities persevered, often by adapting their practices, seeking local protection, and demonstrating their unwavering piety and utility to their cities. Their story is a powerful reminder that freedom and independence, especially for women in the Middle Ages, often came at a high cost, demanding constant vigilance and adaptation in the face of both powerful patronage and fierce opposition. Number 8. They were active participants in charity and nursing. The Beguine Sisterhoods were not just places of spiritual retreat. They were active, vibrant centers of social welfare, deeply embedded in the fabric of their urban communities. One of their most consistent and aidable contributions was their extensive involvement in charity, and perhaps most notably in nursing the sick. This practical hands-on service was a cornerstone of their mission, a way to live out their Christian devotion not in cloistered isolation, but through direct engagement with the suffering of the world around them. Within almost every beguinage, one would find an infirmary, a dedicated space for the care of the ill. These were not merely places for Beguines themselves when they fell sick, though they served that purpose as well. These infirmaries often opened their doors to the poor, the destitute, and the marginalized of the surrounding city. When plagues swept through medieval towns, or when famine left many weak and vulnerable, the Beguine infirmaries often became crucial havens of care, providing solace and medical attention where little else existed. The Beguines who worked in these infirmaries were skilled caregivers. They learned to prepare herbal remedies, administer comfort, and manage the often challenging conditions of infectious diseases. Their work was not glamorous. It involved cleaning wounds, changing soiled linens, preparing nourishing broths, and providing spiritual comfort to those facing the end of their lives. This was a demanding and often dangerous profession, yet it was undertaken with deep commitment, driven by their desire to serve Christ through serving their fellow human beings. Beyond the infirmaries, Beguines engaged in a wide range of charitable activities. They distributed food to the hungry, often using their own earnings or donations received by the beguinage. They clothed the naked, providing garments that they often made themselves in their workshops. They cared for orphans, sometimes taking them into the beguinage to raise and educate them. They also offered shelter to women in need, whether they were impoverished, widowed, or fleeing difficult circumstances. Consider the role of Beguines in cities like Cologne or Strasbourg, major urban centers that attracted large populations, many of whom lived in poverty. The Beguines of these cities became integral parts of the local social safety net. They were often the first revivers to crises, providing aid when city authorities or established church institutions were slow to react or simply overwhelmed. Their practical compassion filled a vital gap in medieval urban society. Their charitable work was also a form of evangelism, demonstrating their faith through concrete actions rather than just words. It was a visible manifestation of their piety and contributed to their reputation for holiness among the general populace. This positive perception often garnered them support and protection from the very secular authorities who sometimes eyed their independence with suspicion. Their contributions were too valuable to ignore. This active engagement in charity and nursing stands in stark contrast to the often more contemplative and enclosed lives of traditional nuns. While nuns prayed for the world, Beguines often worked directly in it, literally touching the sick and the suffering. This outward focus was a defining characteristic of their way of life, reflecting a spiritual understanding that found God not just in contemplation and prayer, but in the hands-on service to others, especially the most vulnerable members of society. It was a powerful testament to their commitment to practical compassion. Number 7. They innate a fluid social nobility for women. One of the most remarkable and often overlooked aspects of the Beguine movement was its capacity to transcend the rigid social hierarchies of the Middle Ages. For women especially, medieval society offered limited pathways: marriage, the cloister, or a life of extreme vulnerability. The Beguines, however, provided an alternative that was surprisingly open to women from a wide spectrum of social and economic backgrounds, creating communities where noblewomen and peasants, wealthy widows and poor laborers, often lived side by side. Traditional monastic orders, while theoretically open to all, often required a significant dowry or family connections, effectively limiting entry to the wealthy elite. Marriage, of course, was almost entirely dictated by social status and economic considerations. But the Beguine movement, particularly in its earlier, less formalized stages, offered a pathway to a devout life that was accessible to a much broader range of women. A wealthy widow from a prominent merchant family might join a beguinage, bringing with her substantial property and financial resources. She would often purchase her own house within the beguinage walls, perhaps even employing a servant or two, and live a comfortable, albeit devout, life. Her presence would contribute to the economic stability and prestige of the community, and her administrative skills might be put to use in the governance of the beguinage. Simultaneously, a young woman from a humble peasant family, perhaps, seeking to escape the drudgery of agricultural labor or an unwanted marriage, could also find a place. She might not bring a dowry or property, but she would contribute her labor, perhaps spinning wool, weaving textiles, or working in the beguinage's infirmary. Her work would help sustain the community, and in return, she would receive shelter, food, spiritual guidance, and the protection of the beguinage walls. She would gain a measure of dignity and independence she might not have found elsewhere. Consider the demographic makeup of beguinages in thriving commercial centers like Ghent or Leuven. These communities often reflected the diverse urban populations around them. You would find women who spoke different dialects, came from different villages, and had vastly different prior experiences. Yet within the beguinage, they shared a common purpose: to live a devout life of service and contemplation. This mixing of social classes was not always without its challenges. Differences in background, expectations, and personal habits would inevitably arise. However, the shared spiritual ideal and the communal structure of the beguinage often fostered a sense of sisterhood that transcended these divisions. They worked together, prayed together, and supported each other, creating a unique social laboratory where traditional class barriers were, if not entirely dissolved, at least significantly softened. This social mobility, for those of lower social status, it offered a chance for education, a measure of economic security, and a respected place in society that might otherwise be denied to them. For those of higher status, it provided an avenue for spiritual fulfillment and active charity beyond the confines of their aristocratic homes, often allowing them to escape the burden of arranged marriages or unwanted domestic lives. The Beguine movement thus created a unique space where women, regardless of their birth or wealth, could pursue a life of devotion and independence. It was a powerful testament to their ability to adapt and innovate, offering a meaningful alternative to the rigid social structures of their time, and proving that women of all strata could find common ground in a shared spiritual quest. Number 6. Their spiritual authority was often direct and personal. The medieval church was a highly structured, hierarchical institution, with authority flowing from the Pope down through bishops, priests, and abbots. For most laypeople, and especially for women, direct access to spiritual authority was largely mediated through male clergy. Yet, for many Beguines, their spiritual lives were characterized by a profound sense of direct personal connection to God, often bypassing traditional ecclesiastical intermediaries. This radical interiority and direct spiritual experience were both a source of their power and, at times, a cause for deep suspicion from the authorities. Many Beguines were mystics. Figures like Mechtilde of Magdeburg, a prominent Beguine from the 13th century, chronicled her visions and profound experiences of divine love in her work, The Flowing Light of the Godhead. Her writings speak of a direct, intimate relationship with God, often described in highly emotional and even erotic language, reflecting a soul's yearning for complete union with the divine. These experiences were not mediated through a priest or a confessor. They were personal encounters with the sacred, validating their own spiritual authority. Hedwige of Antwerp, a Beguine from the Low Countries, also wrote extensively about her intense mystical experiences. Her letters and visions describe a spiritual journey filled with both ecstatic joy and profound spiritual desolation, always striving for min or divine love in its purest form. These were not intellectual exercises. They were lived spiritual realities that shaped their understanding of God and their place in the universe. Her insights were considered authoritative by her followers. This emphasis on personal revelation and direct spiritual insight often led Beguines to question or even de-emphasize the need for traditional sacraments or clerical intercession. If one could experience God directly, what was the absolute necessity of a priest? While Beguines certainly attended Mass and received communion, their internal spiritual journey often held greater weight for them. This focus on an unmediated spiritual experience was seen by some as a dangerous affront to the established order, which insisted that salvation came through the Church. The spiritual practices within Beguinages further reinforced this direct connection. Beguines engaged in intense prayer, contemplation, and spiritual reading. They would often gather for informal spiritual discussions, sharing their insights and experiences, learning from each other rather than solely from a male preacher. Some Beguines even became spiritual mentored to others, offering guidance based on their own deep spiritual understanding. This internal spiritual leadership, exercised by women, was highly unusual. Marguerite Porete, whose tragic fate we touched upon, pushed this concept to its extreme. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, described a soul so completely absorbed in divine love that it becomes annihilated of its own will, needing nothing, not even the Church's rules or sacraments, to achieve union with God. While this was a radical interpretation, it stemmed from the same impulse for direct spiritual authority that animated many Beguines. Her teachings, deemed heretical, were a testament to the Church's anxiety about unbridled female spiritual power. This direct, personal, spiritual authority empowered Beguines in a profound way. It allowed them to define their own spiritual paths, to seek God on their own terms, and to articulate their experiences in their own words. It fostered a vibrant intellectual and spiritual culture within the Beguinages, where women were not merely passive recipients of religious instruction, but active, dynamic explorers of the divine. This spiritual autonomy was truly groundbreaking for its time. And while it brought them profound spiritual fulfillment, it also brought them into direct conflict with the traditional gatekeepers of religious truth. Number 5. They focused on vernacular mysticism and writing. In an age when Latin was the language of theology, scholarship, and official church communication, the Beguines distinguished themselves by embracing and promoting the vernacular, the everyday language of the people. This was particularly true in their fervent exploration of mysticism and their prolific output of spiritual writings. This focus on writing in their native tongues, Middle Dutch, Middle High German, Old French, made complex spiritual ideas accessible to a wider audience, including other women, and profoundly shaped the spiritual landscape of medieval Europe. Prior to the Beguines, serious theological and mystical texts were almost exclusively written in Latin, limiting their readership to educated clergy and scholars. Beguines, however, often came from backgrounds where they spoke and read the local language, but not necessarily Latin. Their deep desire for spiritual understanding led them to express their most profound experiences and insights in the language they knew best. This was a revolutionary act, whether intended or not. Consider Mechilde of Magdeburg, a Beguine whose mystical visions were recorded in Middle High German. Her work, The Flowing Light of the Godhead, is not just a theological treatise. It is a passionate, poetic outpouring of her soul's journey towards God. It speaks of divine love in vivid, accessible terms, using analogies from daily life and courtly love poetry, making complex spiritual concepts relatable to ordinary people. Her writings resonated deeply because they spoke directly to the heart in a familiar voice. Eduich, writing in Middle Dutch, created a powerful body of work, including visions, letters, and poems. Her poetry, in particular, is considered some of the finest mystical verse of the period. She used the courtly love tradition to express her intense longing for God, portraying the soul's relationship with the divine as a passionate, often challenging pursuit of men. Her work was read and copied by others, influencing a generation of spiritual seekers in the Low Countries. Marguerite Porete, writing in Old French, penned The Mirror of Simple Souls, a text that explored radical detachment and divine union. Despite its controversial nature and her tragic end, the book was immensely popular and was translated into several languages, including Latin, Middle English, and Italian. Its accessibility in the vernacular contributed to its widespread influence, allowing its ideas to spread far beyond academic or clerical circles. These Beguine writers were not just passively recording their experiences. They were actively shaping spiritual thought. They debated, interpreted, and elaborated on mystical concepts, creating a vibrant intellectual tradition in the vernacular. Their works often circulated as manuscripts, copied by hand within beguinages and by scribes for wider dissemination. This created networks of spiritual learning and exchange among women and lay people who might otherwise have been excluded from theological discourse. The Church initially struggled with this. While some clergy recognized the piety and devotion of these Beguine mystics, others viewed their vernacular writings with suspicion. They feared that profound theological concepts, expressed in everyday language, could be misinterpreted, lead to heresy, or undermine clerical authority. The very accessibility of these texts was seen as a potential threat. The burning of Marguerite Porete's book along with her was a grim warning against such independent spiritual expression. Despite the dangers, the Beguines persisted. Their commitment to vernacular mysticism empowered countless women to engage directly with spiritual ideas, fostering a literate and intellectually active spiritual life within and beyond the beguinage walls. They left behind a rich legacy of spiritual literature, proving that profound wisdom and divine revelation could flow not only through the hallowed halls of Latin scholarship, but also through the everyday voices of women speaking directly to the human soul. Their words continue to echo through history, a testament to the power of shared language and personal spiritual exploration. Number 4. They followed no single universal rule of life. Unlike established monastic orders, such as the Benedictines, Cistercians, or Franciscans, which operated under a codified and universal set of rules, like the rule of Saint Benedict, the Beguines were remarkably diverse. There was no single binding rule of the Beguines that governed every community from Ghent to Strasbourg, from Paris to Cologne. This absence of a universal rule was one of their most defining and surprising characteristics, granting them immense flexibility but also contributing to the Church's confusion and suspicion. Each beguinage developed its own unique customs, statutes, and daily practices. These ordinances or customaries were usually written down and agreed upon by the Beguines themselves, often with the guidance or approval of a local bishop or city authority. This meant that the daily life of a Beguine in one city could differ significantly from that of a Beguine in another, reflecting the local culture, economic conditions, and specific spiritual inclinations of the community. For example, some beguinages might have had stricter requirements for communal prayer and silence, while others might have emphasized active charitable work or specific forms of labor. Some might have required a certain level of financial contribution, while others were more accommodating to poorer women. The great beguinage of Bruges, for instance, known for its emphasis on textile production, would have had different daily rhythms and rules regarding work than a smaller, more contemplative beguinage in a rural area. This localized approach allowed the Beguines to be incredibly adaptable. As new needs arose in their cities, or as external pressures mounted, the beguinages could modify their internal rules to meet those challenges. They could respond to economic shifts, changes in urban demographics, or evolving spiritual trends without waiting for approval from a distant central authority. This agility contributed to their longevity and their ability to thrive in various urban environments. This lack of a universal rule also meant that Beguines were not considered part of a formal religious order in the traditional sense. They did not take solemn, irrevocable vows that bound them for life to a specific rule or institution. This was a key distinction that separated them from nuns. While they lived a devout life, they retained a degree of personal freedom and autonomy that was unprecedented for women living in community during this period. The diversity of their practices, however, also became a source of concern for the Church. Without a clear standardized rule, it was difficult for ecclesiastical authorities to categorize or control them. Were they religious? Were they laywomen? Were they perhaps somewhere in between? This ambiguity made them vulnerable to accusations of unorthodoxy. Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312, which condemned certain Beguine practices, largely did so because of this very lack of a defined universal rule and their perceived independent nature. Yet despite these challenges, the Beguines' ability to self-organize and self-define their spiritual path proved remarkably resilient. It demonstrated that a vibrant, diverse spiritual movement could flourish without the rigid uniformity of traditional monasticism. Their individualized rules reflected their commitment to meeting the specific needs of their members and their urban environments, creating a patchwork of unique spiritual communities that defied easy categorization and left a lasting mark on medieval religious life. Number 3. They lived in the world, not apart from it. One of the most striking contrasts between Beguines and other religious women in the Middle Ages was their physical and social integration into urban life. While traditional nuns lived a life of strict enclosure, cloistered behind high walls, largely cut off from the secular world, Beguines often lived within the very heart of the bustling cities. They existed in the world, actively participating in its economy, social fabric, and spiritual landscape, rather than strictly apart from it. Beguinages were typically established within, or very close to, city walls. They were not remote monastic fortresses in the countryside. Instead, they were vibrant communities nested within urban environments, often with their own streets, squares, churches, and houses. While they had their own protective walls and gates, which might be locked at night for security, these communities were not hermetically sealed. They were porous. Beguines regularly interacted with the outside world. Beguines went to market to buy food and materials. They sold their manufactured goods, like textiles or lace, to city dwellers and merchants. They worked as nurses in city hospitals or in their own infirmaries, caring for the sick of the city. They served as teachers, educating girls and sometimes boys from local families. They participated in city processions, attended public church services, and were known faces in the urban landscape. Their lives were interwoven with the daily rhythms of medieval urban life. Consider the Great Beguinage of Amsterdam or the Grand Beguinage of Leuven. These were not isolated sanctuaries. They were distinct neighborhoods within the city, contributing to its economy and welfare. The Beguines produced goods that were sold in the local markets, adding to the city's commercial vibrancy. Their infirmaries provided crucial healthcare services that benefited the entire population. They were seen as pious and hard-working citizens, not as reclusive religious figures. This close interaction with the secular world meant that Beguines were often exposed to its temptations and challenges. They were not shielded from gossip, commercial pressures, or the changing social mores of urban society, in the same way cloistered nuns were. This openness was a constant concern for church authorities, who worried about their spiritual purity and adherence to religious discipline without the protective barrier of strict enclosure. However, this integration also allowed the Beguines to be highly responsive to the needs of their communities. They were able to adapt their work and their charitable efforts to suit the specific demands of their urban environment. If a new trade emerged, Beguines could learn it. If a new social problem arose, they could address it. Their direct engagement made them effective and relevant. Choice to live in the world was a deliberate and often empowering one. It allowed women to pursue a devout life without completely abandoning their families, their homes, or their worldly responsibilities. It offered a middle path, a way to be spiritual without being entirely removed from society. This unique positioning allowed them to thrive in a way that traditional monasticism could not, fostering a vibrant, independent female spirituality that was deeply connected to the life and needs of the medieval city. Their urban presence was a visual testament to their distinct approach to devotion and independence. Number 2. Their financial independence was a radical concept for women. In medieval Europe, for most women, economic security and independence were rare commodities. A woman's financial well-being was almost entirely tied to a man, her father, her husband, or sometimes a male guardian in a monastery. Yet, the Beguines presented a starkly different model. They were financially independent women who largely supported themselves through their own labor. This economic autonomy was not just unusual, it was a truly radical concept for its time. When a woman joined a beguinage, she often brought her own resources, whether it was a dowry, an inheritance, or savings from her previous life. But unlike nuns, who typically surrendered all their possessions to the monastery, Beguines largely retained ownership of their property. More importantly, they were expected to contribute to their own upkeep and, often, to the communal expenses of the beguinage through their own work. Beguines were highly industrious. They engaged in a wide variety of trades and crafts, often capitalizing on the burgeoning urban economies of the Low Countries and the Rhineland. Their most famous occupation was textile production, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and particularly creating intricate lace. These were highly valued skills that generated significant income. Cities like Bruges and Ghent, known for their textile industries, saw many Beguines contributing substantially to their economic output. Beyond textiles, Beguines worked as nurses, particularly in their own infirmaries or in public hospitals, caring for the sick and the elderly. They were laundresses, bakers, brewers, and seamstresses. Some were scribes, copying manuscripts. Others taught children, offering education to girls and sometimes boys from the surrounding community. They were entrepreneurs, actively participating in the commercial life of their cities. This economic activity meant that Beguines were not reliant on alms or on the charity of wealthy patrons for their daily sustenance. While some beguinages did receive donations, the core of their financial stability came from the productive labor of their members. This self-sufficiency gave them a degree of freedom and dignity that was largely unavailable to other women, whether married or cloistered. They had control over their own money and their own livelihoods. Consider the power dynamics this created. A woman who earned her own living, who was not beholden to a husband or a convent abbot for her food and shelter, possessed a unique form of agency. She could make choices about her life and her spiritual path that were independent of male control. This economic empowerment was a silent but powerful challenge to the patriarchal norms of medieval society. Moreover, their collective economic power could be substantial. A large beguinage with hundreds of women producing high-quality goods or providing essential services, was a significant economic entity within its city. They were respected for their industry and their contribution to the urban economy. This practical utility often afforded them a degree of protection and acceptance from city authorities, who recognized their value. Their financial independence was also a source of pride and purpose. It allowed them to be active contributors to their communities, both within the Beguinage and in the wider city, through their work and their charitable endeavors. This concept of women supporting themselves, living devout lives, without being dependent on traditional male-dominated structures, was truly groundbreaking. It stands as a testament to the Beguines' ingenuity and resilience, showing that women could, and did, carve out a path of economic self-reliance in a world that rarely offered them such opportunities. Number 1. They took no permanent, binding vows. Among all the surprising rules of the Beguine Sisterhoods, perhaps the most astonishing, and the one that truly set them apart, was their refusal to take permanent, binding vows. Unlike nuns who committed themselves for life through solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, Beguines retained the fundamental freedom to leave their communities at any time, to marry, or to return to secular life. This radical non-commitment was the bedrock of their independence and the source of both their unique appeal and the Church's profound unease. In medieval society, once a woman became a nun, her vows were irrevocable. She was considered dead to the world, and returning to secular life was virtually impossible without extreme ecclesiastical intervention. Her identity was entirely subsumed by her religious profession. For Beguines, however, the commitment was a personal choice, renewed daily, or at least annually. They made simple vows of chastity and obedience to their mistress while they were living in the Beguinage, but these were temporary. This meant that a young woman could join a Beguinage for a few years, perhaps, seeking spiritual guidance or a safe haven, and then choose to leave to marry or pursue another path. A widow might join for a period of mourning and contemplation, only to return to her family when she felt ready. This flexibility allowed the Beguinages to attract a wider array of women than traditional convents, including those who sought a devout life without the lifelong irreversible commitment. Consider the implications of this freedom. It meant that Beguines were not trapped by their spiritual choice. They were not bound by an unbreakable contract. This personal autonomy was almost unheard of for medieval women who typically moved from the control of a father to the control of a husband or into the strict confines of a monastery. The Beguines carved out a distinct path, one where their spiritual commitment was a continuous, conscious decision, not a one-time, final surrender. This freedom, however, was also precisely what made the Church so suspicious. For centuries, the Church hierarchy understood religious life through the lens of formal perpetual vows. The idea of women living a devout life in community, yet retaining the ability to leave at will, defied established norms and challenged their authority without solemn vows. Were Beguines truly religious? Could they be trusted? This theological ambiguity contributed significantly to the persecution they sometimes faced. Council of Vienne in the early 14th century, which condemned some Beguine practices, specifically targeted their lack of formal vows as a problematic aspect of their life. Yet, for the Beguines themselves, this lack of permanent vows was often empowering. It signaled a profound trust in their personal devotion and the strength of their spiritual community. Their commitment was not enforced by external authority or a binding contract, but by their own internal conviction and the mutual support of their sisters. It meant that their chosen path was one of continuous spiritual striving, a daily affirmation of their faith rather than a single fixed point. This unique freedom to choose, to enter, and to leave highlights the truly unconventional nature of the Beguine movement. It was a radical experiment in female autonomy, spiritual flexibility, and personal agency, a testament to women's desire to forge their own paths to God and community outside the rigid structures of their time. The absence of permanent vows was not a weakness, but a foundational strength, allowing them to adapt, endure, and offer a profound alternative to traditional medieval life. It stands as the most surprising and perhaps most liberating rule of the Beguine Sisterhoods.